Welcome, champions, to the next overview and tier list ranking, featuring the newest champion. This is where we'll break down their mechanics and place them in my overall tier list for every champion in the game. So let's talk about Karlach, the chaotic good tiefling barbarian in Seed 4, and next addition to the absolute adversaries. And as you probably know by now, that means she's from that RPG no one has ever heard of, Baldur's Gate 3. This bundle of brimstone is ready to tap dance on the corpses of your enemies, and serves your formation as a DPS, support, and tank. Her basic attack will have her move up to the closest enemy on screen and swing her great axe at it in a wide arc, dealing damage to all enemies in her cleaving range. Her ultimate ability will take understanding her kit first before I go into details, because it is uniquely tied to her other formation abilities. So let's dive into those. Her bread and butter, damage buffing formation ability is the Fury of Avernus, where she increases the damage of all champions in her own column and the column behind her, including her. For those paying attention, that's right, she's a new DPS with a positional formation ability for Artemis to observe. As an absolute adversary, she of course has Ceramorphosis, but it works differently this time around. Instead of being tied to her damage buffing, Karlach increases the health of other champions by a flat 20% of hers, further increased by 2% additively, for each Ceramorphosis stack in the formation. This is a first for the affiliation, where Ceramorphosis isn't based on damage buffing, and also doesn't have a gear slot tied to it, which is unfortunate because these are generally pre-stack. Though, don't be afraid, Karlach still has multiple multipliers. One of those being Rage, where every time she attacks or is attacked, she gains 1 stack of Rage, capped at 50. Fury of Avernus will be increased for each Rage stack, stacking multiplicatively. And keep in mind, she loses 60% of her stacks when changing areas. Her other multiplier, an Experienced Gladiator, will increase the damage of Fury of Avernus for each Zariel patron you've completed. And there are plenty out there to make this bonus rather girthy. She also has more utility to offer, first through Infernal Engine, where as long as she has 20 or more rage stacks, she ignites on fire, dealing 0.1 second of bud damage for each rage stack to enemies that attack her, stacking additively. So at the cap of 50 rage, she's dealing 5 seconds worth of bud every time she's attacked. Then for a sprinkle of availability, and to synergize with an Experienced Gladiator, she also gains Champion of Zariel, allowing her to be used in any Zariel patron variant regardless of restriction. Her specializations are tied to her rage, 2 for focusing on damage buffing, and 1 for actual effective healing. More specifically, 1 for focusing on her becoming a damage dealer for your group, 1 for her damage buffing, and 1 for self-sustainability. Berserker makes her lean into her DPS role, increasing her own damage by 50% for each rage stack she has when she's at or above 20 stacks, stacking multiplicatively. Wildheart has her lean into her tank role, where she will heal for an impressive 10% of her maximum health every second as long as she is at or above 20 stacks of rage. I just have to say, guys, why are the only champions with viable healing mechanics tanks? How do we still not have a healer with percentage-based healing? Why? Anyway, Wild Magic has her lean into her support role, increasing the effect of Fury of Avernus by 100% for each stack of Ceramorphosis in the group, as long as she is at or above 20 rage. This gives her a way to scale off Ceramorphosis, but not as well as the rest of the affiliation, as there is no gear tied to Ceramorphosis itself or her specializations. Still, this is the clear pick if you want raw damage buffing, unless Karlach herself is your DPS, then take Berserker. So now that we understand her formation abilities and specializations, let's loop back to her ultimate, Soul Coin. Once you activate it, she'll go Super Saiyan, lasting until her ultimate comes off cooldown, or until you complete a new boss level. During this time, she will not lose rage stacks when changing areas, and the rage cap will be increased to 100. So you can farm up to 100, change to the boss you're pushing, and use that increased power to take down the boss. This increases the output of her main buff, Fury of Avernus, and her own personal damage if you take the Berserker Specialization, as well as increasing how much bud damage she puts out when she's attacked, with Infernal Engine. Her equipment is on the decent side, 1 for all damage, 1 for health, as she's a tank, then 1 for her Fury of Avernus, and then the 2 multipliers for it, Rage and Experienced Gladiator, finishing with Ultimate Cooldown, though the Ultimate Cooldown is kind of a weird one in this case, since it technically just gives you less time to build up and maintain that 100 stack of Rage. But even with this gear slot capped out, her ultimate cooldown is still rather large, so you'll still have an adequate amount of time to work with it. Her feats aren't anything special, the only epic being a self-DPS and taunt combo, which is handy if you want her as your main DPS, but other than that, just mediocre of what you would come to expect. So let's talk about her event, Midwinter. This year we have Karlach, Fen, and Rust. All interesting champions for different reasons. Fen has a decent kit and is a positional buffing DPS herself as well, but more importantly will increase the speed of your patron challenge progression. And Rust is the best gold find in his seat, but not much else. They're all worth unlocking, as you should strive to do anyway, but as far as a hard focus, I think Karlach wins out in the end. But do keep in mind it is Rust's last year before he is retired to only being unlockable with time gates. Now what about her achievement and adventure variants? Her achievement is very simple, requiring you to kill 10,000 enemies while Karlach has at least 20 rage stacks. Actively using her will eventually get you there, or just park her somewhere where she can farm it up. All of her variants force you to use her in your formation, able to be moved but not removed. With her first variant, only the champions in the front 2 columns can deal damage. So you'll want to keep Karlach and your DPS both in those columns to sync up with her damage buffing. The second focuses on her rage, where she starts with it unlocked, as well as the Fury of Avernus. The backmost slot of your formation will be taken up by Clive, and all damage, even click damage, is reduced to 1 until Karlach reaches 20 stacks of rage. To compensate, Karlach will also gain a stack of rage each time any champion in the formation attacks. She'll more quickly get to that threshold that makes her even more potent, so you just have to wait a bit for it to stack. The third will only allow the use of champions who are available for the Zariel patron, restricting it to those with ability scores of Strength 10 or above and Charisma 13 or above. If you can complete basic Zariel variants, this will be a breeze. None of these variants really should cause anyone any trouble. Her availability is good, not the best, but good. Available for Mert and Vajra naturally, and with that Champions of Zariel, anything Zariel throws at you, and ready for all but the Day 1 intelligence restriction for trials. She's a new Artemis option, which is nice, but that's coming from a seat with plenty of good Artemis options, like Kent, Andreas, and Crux. And in fact, Karlach is quite similar to Crux. They both scale up 1 positional ability hard as you stay in a zone, and they're both tanks that offer a buff to 2 different columns. 1 scales with completed adventures in a campaign, and 1 scales with variants from a patron. Quite similar, in fact. Still, she's quite good, serving multiple roles with a buff that scales up well, and has solid options for double downing as either a DPS or increasing that buffing potential. I'm putting her in the A tier, alongside her allies, Shadowheart and Will. My only real complaint about her, and this is more of a critique of the absolute adversaries as a whole, is that it's great we have our first tank from that affiliation, but having her also be a DPS that is required to be in the same column as one of her other compatriots that isn't a tank if you want her to DPS, while Karlach is the only tank, is kinda clunky. But that's not against Karlach's kit, just the affiliation as a whole. You might ask why one would want to use Karlach as a DPS over Lae'zel when Lae'zel's an option for someone focusing the absolute adversaries. And that's because Berserker scales better than Wild Magic for raw numbers, and Lae'zel's DPS specialization is minor by comparison. So if you were looking to get the best raw output from the absolute adversaries at this point, you're already hamstringing yourself a little bit, as there aren't many synergizing tanks to pair with them right now, And because of that, it may be difficult to place Lae'zel and Karlach in the same column, if Karlach is your DPS. Anyway, thanks for coming around. Destroy that like, sub, and bell for me. Leave a comment on what you think of Karlach and the Baldur's Gate 3 crew so far. And of course, have a hell of a time out there, champion.